$50,000 for my silence, he said, his smile as cold as the blue light from the laptop. I was trapped in a shack deep in the Caribbean jungle. My perfect affair turned into a brutal nightmare. But as the blade caught the moonlight, I realized the real monster wasn't the man threatening me. It was the husband I thought I knew. The sun over Saint Lucia does not merely shine. It dominates everything with an iron fist of gold. I watched the turquoise expanse of the bay transform into a sheet of molten glass, blinding and beautiful in its relentless glare. From my seat on the shaded terrace, the heat felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, making every breath a conscious effort. It was the kind of beauty that demanded total submission, a tropical paradise that felt more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary of rest. Every palm tree stood unnaturally still as if frozen by the intensity of the light. My husband, Arthur, sat beside me, his presence as predictable and steady as a clock's ticking. I watched his pale, slender fingers methodically apply a thick layer of sunblock to his shoulders, his movements precise and clinical. There was no passion in his touch, only the practiced caution of a man who feared the world's edges and its capacity to burn. For 12 long years this sterility had been the rhythm of our lives, a marriage built on safety and the avoidance of any real friction. I felt the dryness of his skin even without touching him, a reflection of the emotional desert we had occupied. He looked up at me and offered that soft, apologetic smile he always wore when he thought I might be bored or uncomfortable. It was the smile of a man who wanted to be enough but secretly knew he was merely a placeholder in the grand theater of my life. I felt like an expensive exhibit trapped behind a pane of perfectly cleaned glass, admired but never truly touched by the person standing on the other side. Everything about us was polished to a high shine, leaving no room for the messy reality of human desire. We were a portrait of success that had long ago forgotten how to breathe. Arthur asked if I wanted him to order some mineral water, making sure to specify that it should be still and served at room temperature. His concern for the smallest details of our comfort was a form of suffocation, a gentle strangulation by 1,000 silk threads of care. I simply nodded, my gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sky bled into the ocean in a seamless blur of blue. There was a terrifying correctness to our vacation, a sequence of events so well planned that they felt drained of all actual life. Even the water he handed me felt sterile and devoid of any real character. The air around us was thick with the scent of expensive coconut lotion and the salt spray of the Atlantic. Each wave that broke against the shore sounded like a rhythmic sigh, a constant reminder of the ocean's patient power compared to our fragile existence. I could feel the sweat beginning to bead at the nape of my neck, a tiny rebellion against the cool, air-conditioned luxury of our villa. It was the only thing that felt real in this manufactured paradise of white linen and organized excursions. I found myself craving a storm, something to crack the pristine surface of this artificial peace. As the afternoon faded into a bruised purple twilight, Arthur retired to the bedroom to organize the schedule for the coming days. He enjoyed the logistics of travel more than the travel itself, finding solace in spreadsheets and confirmed reservations. I stayed behind, listening to the muffled sound of his laptop keyboard clicking away, a digital heartbeat in the silence of our suite. He was safe, he was kind, and he was utterly incapable of understanding the hunger that was beginning to gnaw at the edges of my soul. I watched the shadows lengthen across the floor, feeling a strange pull toward the dark. Eventually, I stepped out onto the marble balcony, the night air wrapping around me like a damp, heavy velvet cloak. The transformation of the island after dark was profound. The orderly resort now felt wild, untamed, and pulsing with hidden vibrations. The chirping of insects was a frantic, rhythmic percussion that seemed to echo the racing of my own heart in the stillness. I stood there for a long time, watching the moon cast silver shadows across the manicured gardens and the dark, restless water beyond. The ocean no longer looked like glass, but like a vast, breathing beast. My gaze fell to the floor, and I noticed a small dark shape resting near the edge of the white marble railing. It was a tiny hummingbird, its once vibrant emerald feathers now dull and matted against the cold stone. Its neck was twisted at an unnatural, sickening angle, a sudden and violent end to such a delicate creature. I reached down to touch it, expecting the coldness of death, but the tiny body was still shockingly warm under my fingertip. The fragility of its life made my own breath hitch in my throat, a sudden reminder of how quickly everything could be broken. In that moment of silence, I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, as if the darkness itself had exhaled. I looked up and saw a figure standing at the edge of the garden's shadow, perfectly still and blended into the foliage. It was Malik, the local guide we had hired to show us the hidden parts of the island that were not on Arthur's maps. His presence was a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the villa, a silhouette of raw power and quiet menace that seemed to command the very air around him. He stood like a part of the earth, unmovable and deep. His skin was so dark it seemed denser than the night, absorbing the moonlight rather than reflecting it. He didn't move or speak, but his eyes were wide and frighteningly alive, fixed on me with an intensity that stripped away my defenses. There was no apology in his gaze, only a deep predatory awareness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt a sudden sharp jolt of anxiety that tasted like iron, realizing that the safety of my marriage was a lie I told myself to stay asleep. The silence between us was heavy, filled with a tension I didn't know how to name. Malik slowly stepped forward into a sliver of light, his movements fluid and silent like a panther moving through the undergrowth. He didn't look at the dead bird at my feet, but his focus remained locked on my face, reading the fear and the fascination written there. The air between us became thick with an unspoken tension, a heavy pull that felt far more dangerous than the ocean's undertow. I knew then that the world Arthur built for me was about to be torn apart by something I could not resist. He was the storm I had been waiting for, and I was terrified. I wanted to look away, to retreat back into the safety of the bedroom and the comfort of my husband's predictable presence. But my feet were frozen to the marble, and my heart was hammering against my ribs with a violence I had never known. Malik took a single step closer, and I saw his teeth flash in a slow, knowing grin that promised to devour the person I had spent 35 years pretending to be. The silence of the night was suddenly broken by the sharp, metallic click of a gate closing somewhere nearby, a sound that resonated in my chest like a final warning. The morning arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as an aggressive invasion of thick, humid air that seemed to seep through the very walls of our suite. I woke up with my skin already damp, the memory of the previous night's encounter still humming in my veins like a low-frequency vibration. The sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long dusty beams across the marble floor where the hummingbird had died. Everything felt too bright and too loud, as if the volume of the world had been turned up several notches while I slept. I felt a strange heaviness in my limbs and a reluctance to return to the polished routine of my marriage. Arthur was already up, moving about the room with his usual frantic energy. I watched him check and recheck his hiking boots, his face a mask of concentration as he ensured the laces were perfectly even. He was muttering something about the importance of proper hydration and the potential for heat exhaustion in this climate. There was a stack of supplies on the mahogany table: bottled water, specialized energy bars, and a comprehensive first aid kit that looked like it belonged in a field hospital. His world was one of preparations and precautions, an endless attempt to insulate himself from the unpredictability of nature. I dressed in silence, choosing light linen clothes that felt flimsy against the mounting pressure of the day. Every time I caught my reflection in the mirror, I saw a woman I didn't quite recognize, someone whose eyes held a flicker of something dark and expectant. Arthur handed me a hat and a bottle of high-protection sunscreen, his touch brief and medicinal. He was worried about the ultraviolet index, citing statistics he had read in a travel brochure earlier that morning. I wanted to tell him that no amount of lotion could protect us from what I had felt in the garden, but the words stayed trapped in my throat. We walked down the paved path toward the resort's entrance, the scent of blooming hibiscus clashing with the faint smell of diesel from the idling vehicles. The heat was already a physical force, shimmering off the asphalt in waves that distorted the landscape. At the foot of the rugged black Jeep, Malik was waiting for us. He didn't wave or offer a professional greeting. He simply stood there, leaning against the metal frame with a casual confidence that made the entire resort look like a fragile movie set. His presence was so visceral and real that it seemed to drain the color from everything else around him. He wore a simple, faded shirt that strained against his broad shoulders, and his dark trousers were dusty from some earlier task. There was nothing refined or managed about him, and yet he commanded the space with an effortless authority that Arthur could never hope to achieve. His eyes met mine for a brief second, a silent acknowledgement of our encounter on the balcony, before he turned his attention to the luggage. I felt a sharp pull in my chest, a mixture of fear and a desperate attraction. He was a force of nature, untamed and unapologetic, standing in the middle of our carefully curated world. Arthur began to explain his requirements for the trip, his voice thin and high-pitched in the open air. He talked about the necessity of frequent breaks and the exact coordinates he wanted to visit, pointing at a map with a hand that trembled slightly. Malik listened without nodding, his face an unreadable mask of polite indifference. He didn't seem to care about the schedule or the safety protocols that Arthur was so obsessed with. He was simply waiting for the noise to stop so we could move. I watched them both, the stark contrast between them making me feel a deep, uncomfortable sense of shame. When it was time to board, Malik moved to the side of the Jeep and reached out a hand to help me climb into the high passenger seat. As my fingers brushed against his palm, a jolt of heat traveled up my arm, more intense than the tropical sun. His hand was rough and calloused, the skin feeling like sun-warmed granite against my own soft palm. He didn't let go immediately. Instead, he gripped my elbow with a firm pressure that felt like an assertion of ownership. In that single fleeting moment of contact, the hierarchy of our group shifted irrevocably, and I knew that he felt the change as well. Arthur scrambled into the back seat, surrounded by his bags of antiseptics and spare batteries. He was busy adjusting his seatbelt and checking the signal on his satellite phone, oblivious to the silent exchange that had just occurred. He looked like a small child surrounded by too much equipment, lost in a world he didn't understand. Malik climbed into the driver's seat, his movements fluid and economical, and started the engine with a roar that drowned out Arthur's latest comment about the humidity. The vibration of the machine traveled through the floorboards and into my bones, a primal hum. We left the manicured grounds of the hotel behind, the smooth pavement quickly giving way to a rutted dirt road that wound upward into the mountains. The transition was jarring. The lush, controlled beauty of the gardens was replaced by a dense, tangled wilderness that seemed to be closing in on us from all sides. Tall ferns brushed against the sides of the Jeep, and the air became even heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation. I looked back once at the resort, but it had already vanished behind a curtain of green, leaving us alone in a world that didn't care for our comfort. The road eventually disappeared altogether, and Malik parked the Jeep in a small clearing where the trees grew so close together, they formed a natural cathedral. We had to continue on foot, following a narrow trail that was barely visible beneath the carpet of fallen leaves. Malik led the way, his machete occasionally clearing a path with a single effortless stroke. He moved with a predatory grace, his body attuned to the rhythm of the forest in a way that made him seem like an extension of the landscape. I followed close behind him, my eyes fixed on the rhythmic movement of his shoulders as he walked. Behind me, I could hear Arthur's heavy labored breathing as he struggled to keep up with our pace. He was constantly tripping over hidden roots and slipping on the moss-covered stones, his groans of frustration punctuating the silence of the woods. Every few minutes, he would stop to wipe his face with a silk handkerchief that was already soaked with sweat, his complexion turning a concerning shade of mottled red. He looked entirely out of place, a creature of the office trying to survive in a place that demanded physical competence. I felt a cold, sharp blade of resentment toward his weakness. The jungle was alive with sounds that I couldn't identify, the sharp crack of a branch, the sudden whir of wings, and a constant buzzing that seemed to come from the air itself. Exotic birds screamed from the canopy, their calls sounding like mockery directed at our slow, clumsy progress. The heat was no longer a weight but a living thing, wrapping itself around my throat and making my head swim with a dizzying intensity. I could smell the sharp metallic scent of my own sweat and the spicy, musk-like aroma that radiated from Malik as he moved through the dense, vibrant undergrowth with ease. After what felt like hours of climbing, the sound of rushing water began to grow louder, a deep thrumming that vibrated in the ground beneath our feet. We rounded a bend in the trail and suddenly the trees opened up to reveal a hidden oasis. A massive waterfall cascaded down a jagged cliff face, its white spray catching the sunlight and creating small, shimmering rainbows in the air. At the base of the falls was a deep dark pool of water, perfectly still and framed by massive boulders. It was a place of breathtaking, violent beauty, untouched by the hands of architects or modern designers. Malik turned to us, his face glistening with a thin sheen of perspiration that made his skin look like polished obsidian. He pointed toward the water and suggested that we take a swim to cool down before we began the long trek back to the jeep. There was a challenge in his eyes, a silent dare that was directed specifically at me. He stood by the edge of the pool, looking like a guardian of the spring, his physical presence dominating the small clearing. I could feel the coolness of the spray on my face, a seductive invitation to wash away the grime and the tension of our long journey. Arthur immediately stepped forward, his face twisted in a look of profound disapproval as he stared at the dark, swirling water. He began to recite a list of reasons why swimming was a terrible idea, citing the risk of waterborne parasites and the lack of proper safety equipment. His voice sounded thin and ridiculous against the roar of the waterfall, a small man trying to impose his fears on a world that was far larger than his imagination. He reached into his bag for a bottle of hand sanitizer, his fingers fumbling with the plastic cap as he looked around with suspicion and growing dread. I didn't wait for him to finish his lecture on hygiene. I began to unbutton my linen shirt, my movements slow and deliberate as I felt Malik's gaze burning into my skin. I wanted to feel the water against my body, to submerge myself in the cold and the dark and forget the sound of my husband's voice. I stepped out of my shoes and moved toward the edge of the pool, my heart thumping against my ribs with a mixture of rebellion and desire. I was done with being careful. I was done with being safe. I wanted to feel something that wasn't planned or approved by a travel agency or a doctor. The water was shockingly cold, a sharp needle of ice that seemed to pierce my skin and wake up every dormant nerve in my body. I waded in deeper, the dark surface rising to meet my waist and then my chest, my clothes clinging to me like a second, heavier skin. I let out a long, shaky breath as I submerged myself completely, the roar of the falls becoming a muffled thunder in my ears. For a moment I was suspended in a world of pure sensation, a place where Arthur and his schedules didn't exist. I felt a strange sense of liberation, a shedding of the persona I had worn for years. When I surfaced, I saw Malik standing on a flat rock just above the water's edge. He was watching me with an intensity that made the cold water feel like it was boiling around me. His eyes moved slowly over my wet clothes, which were now translucent and clinging to every curve of my body with a shameless intimacy. There was no professional distance in his expression, only a raw, primitive affirmation of his own power and my vulnerability. He looked at me not as a client or a guest, but as something he could take if he chose to, a silent claim that echoed through the small canyon. Arthur was standing several yards away, perched precariously on a large stone and holding his phone high in the air as he searched for a signal. He looked incredibly small and pathetic in his pristine beige shorts, his face pinched with the effort of trying to reconnect with the world he had left behind. He was completely oblivious to the silent drama unfolding between me and the guide, focused entirely on the digital bars on his screen. He was a man who couldn't exist without a connection to the network, a hollow shell that collapsed the moment the infrastructure of his life was taken away. The contrast between the two men was so stark it was almost comical, yet there was a deep horror in the realization of how little I actually knew the man I had married. Malik continued to stare at me, his presence filling the space between us like a physical weight, while Arthur continued his fruitless search for a signal. I stayed in the water, feeling the weight of my wet clothes and the heat of the gaze that refused to let me go. I knew then that the boundaries of my life had been blurred beyond repair, and that I was no longer the woman who had arrived on this island a few days ago. The air near the waterfall was rich with the scent of wet stone, crushed ferns, and a deep ancient musk that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth. It was an intoxicating mixture that clouded my judgment and made the world of Connecticut feel like a faded photograph. I watched a large blue butterfly flutter across the pool, its wings a flash of impossible color against the dark green of the trees. Everything here was more vibrant, more dangerous, and more alive than anything I had ever known. I felt a sudden sharp pang of hunger for a life that wasn't measured in spreadsheets. Arthur let out a loud, frustrated groan as he finally gave up on his phone, his face twisted in a scowl of pure annoyance. He shouted toward me, asking if I was finished with my reckless display, and reminding me that we had a dinner reservation to keep at the resort. His voice was like a jarring chord in a beautiful piece of music, a reminder of the mundane reality that was waiting for us back at the villa. I didn't answer him. I only looked at Malik, whose eyes had never left mine. The guide gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a secret that only the two of us shared. I slowly waded out of the pool, the water dripping from my hair and clothes in heavy rhythmic splashes. Malik didn't move to help me this time. He simply watched as I struggled to gain my footing on the slippery rocks, his expression one of quiet, dominant amusement. My clothes were heavy and cold, making me feel exposed and clumsy as I climbed back toward the trail where Arthur was waiting with a towel. Every step I took felt like I was moving toward a prison, the weight of my wet garments a physical manifestation of the expectations that were about to be placed back upon my shoulders. Arthur rushed toward me, his face a mask of disapproval and irritation as he threw the towel over my shoulders. He began to complain about the damage the salt and minerals in the water would do to my skin, his hands moving frantically as he tried to dry me off. He was touching me, but I felt nothing but a dull, cold resentment. He was treating me like a broken piece of equipment that needed to be repaired, rather than a woman who had just experienced a moment of profound awakening. I looked past him at Malik, who was already turning away to lead us back into the darkness of the forest. The trek back to the jeep was a blur of heat, exhaustion, and a growing sense of dread. The jungle seemed even more claustrophobic than before, the trees leaning in closer as if to catch the scent of the change that had occurred within me. Arthur continued to stumble and complain, his voice a constant background noise to my own internal turmoil. Malik moved ahead of us, his pace steady and relentless, never once looking back to see if we were keeping up. He knew we would follow. He knew that he had already captured something more important than our physical presence in the deep woods. When we finally reached the clearing, the jeep was sitting there like a dark, waiting beast. Malik opened the door for me, his hand once again brushing against mine with that same electric heat. This time I didn't pull away. I leaned into the contact, a silent surrender to the force that was pulling me toward the abyss. Arthur scrambled into the back, his movements clumsy and desperate as he searched for his bag of supplies. The engine roared to life once more, and as we pulled away from the jungle, I knew that the silence between us was no longer a sign of peace, but a prelude to a storm. The drive back was filled with the sound of the wind whipping through the open windows and the rhythmic bouncing of the jeep on the rough road. I stared out at the passing green blur, my mind racing with thoughts of the night to come and the secret meetings that I knew were inevitable. I could feel Malik's presence beside me, a constant physical pressure that made it impossible to breathe normally. Arthur was busy checking his phone again, his face lighting up as the signal finally returned, connecting him back to the world of safety. He was happy to be back. I was mourning. As the familiar white buildings of the resort came into view, the sense of confinement returned with a crushing force. The perfectly manicured lawns and the polite smiles of the staff felt like a mockery of the raw reality I had just witnessed. Malik stopped the jeep at the main entrance and stepped out to open the doors. He looked at Arthur with a professional, distant smile, but when his eyes met mine, the mask slipped for a fraction of a second. I saw the hunger and the promise of what was to come, a dark invitation that I knew I would not be able to refuse, regardless of the consequences. Arthur thanked Malik with a curt, dismissive nod and a small tip, his mind already on the dinner menu and the temperature of the wine. We walked toward the lobby, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back, a gesture of hollow possession that made my skin crawl. I looked back over my shoulder one last time and saw Malik leaning against the jeep, watching us go. He wasn't looking at Arthur. He was looking at me, his silhouette a dark, jagged tear in the fabric of our perfect afternoon. The sun was setting, and I knew that the night would bring no peace, only a beautiful fall. I stood in the heavy silence of our suite, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of my husband's chest. The air-conditioned chill felt like a morgue, a stark contrast to the boiling world outside the glass doors. Arthur was deep in a chemical slumber, courtesy of the double dose of sleeping pills I had stirred into his evening chamomile tea with a silver spoon. There was something profoundly pathetic about his vulnerability, his mouth slightly agape as he drifted further away from me into a fog of pharmaceutical peace. He looked like a man who had never known a single moment of genuine, jagged risk, and I felt a cold surge of contempt for his innocence. I slipped into a thin robe of charcoal silk, the fabric feeling like a cool, treacherous skin against my bare shoulders. My movements were calculated and feline as I bypassed the expensive leather luggage that sat like tombstones in the corner of the room. The door clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire hotel floor, but Arthur did not stir. He was anchored in his artificial dreamscape. As I stepped into the carpeted hallway, the scent of industrial lavender and stale air followed me, a reminder of the suffocating domesticity I was about to abandon for the night. I was leaving the light for the dark. The elevators were silent, moving with a mechanical grace that felt too polite for my racing pulse. I bypassed the main lobby, avoiding the watchful eyes of the night staff who stood behind the mahogany desk like wax figures in a museum of luxury. Instead, I took the service stairs, the raw concrete and flickering fluorescent lights feeling more honest than the velvet-lined corridors above. My bare feet made soft, damp sounds against the stone, a primitive rhythm that matched the growing agitation in my chest. I was escaping a life of 35 years of careful curation, one stair at a time, moving toward something I could not explain. The heavy glass door leading to the gardens pushed back against me with the weight of the tropical night. As I crossed the threshold, the sterile scent of the hotel was instantly devoured by the overwhelming fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. The humidity was a physical entity, a warm, wet hand that pressed against my face and throat, demanding my submission to the elements. I moved off the paved path, my toes sinking into the manicured grass that felt like synthetic fur beneath my feet. Every shadow seemed to pulse with a hidden life, a secret world that thrived only when the tourists were safely tucked away. I reached the edge of the property where the lawn gave way to the unruly, shifting terrain of the beach. The sand was still warm from the day's relentless sun, clinging to my skin as I navigated the line of shadow cast by the towering palms. The ocean was no longer a beautiful backdrop. It was a vast, obsidian void that roared with a restless, hungry energy. I could smell the sharp, sulphurous odor of decaying seaweed washing up on the shore, a scent of rot that felt strangely invigorating compared to the perfume of our suite. I was looking for the darkness within the darkness, the place where the rules ceased to apply. He was there, exactly where the memory of his gaze had promised he would be, standing in the deep shadow of an upturned wooden boat. Malik looked like a statue carved from the very night itself, his presence so still that he was nearly invisible until I was only a few feet away. He did not move to greet me, nor did he offer a single word of welcome or reassurance. He simply waited, letting the silence of the beach do the work of stripping away my remaining pretenses. I felt the weight of my status and my history dissolving under the pressure of his unblinking stare, leaving me with nothing but a raw need. There were no tender words spoken, no romantic overtures that one might expect in a tale of forbidden love. Our connection was stripped of such useless finery, reduced to the base reality of two bodies drawn together by a mutual recognition of power and lack. I stepped closer, the heat radiating from him like a furnace, a sensory overload that made my vision blur at the edges. I could see the glint of the moon in his eyes, a wild, untamed spark that reminded me of the hummingbird I had found broken on the marble floor. But this time I was the one seeking to be broken, to be remade in the crucible of his indifference. He reached out, his dark hand closing around my upper arm with a grip that was firm and devoid of gentleness. His fingers felt like brands of iron against my pale skin, a visual and physical contrast that felt like a violent awakening. He did not pull me toward him. He simply held me in place, asserting his dominance over the space I occupied. I felt a surge of adrenaline that was almost painful, a chemical reaction to the sheer physicality of his presence. My breathing became shallow and jagged as I looked up at him, my head tilted back to meet his gaze in the silver light of the moon, waiting for the fall. I realized in that moment how much I had hungered for this specific type of erasure, to be treated not as a person but as a territory to be claimed. For years I had been the one in control, the one making the decisions and managing the emotions of a man who was too afraid to lead. Malik offered me the luxury of total surrender, a release from the exhausting burden of my own agency. Every gesture he made was an act of quiet authority, a reminder that in this environment, I was the outsider and he was the master. It was a terrifying sensation, yet I drank it in with a thirst that bordered on the psychotic. The air was thick with the scent of his sweat, a musk that was sharp and masculine, mixing with the brine of the ocean and the smoke from a distant fire. His skin felt like coarse velvet under my palms when I finally dared to touch him, a texture that was miles away from the soft, pampered flesh of my husband. There was a raw, unrefined quality to our encounter that felt like a direct assault on the 12 years of decorum I had carefully maintained. Each touch was a deliberate step away from the life I knew, a bridge burning behind me as I followed him deeper into the shadows of the weathered, salt-stained boat. I thought of Arthur, lying upstairs in a stupor of his own making, his mind blissfully unaware of the wreckage I was creating on this beach. I felt a cold, jagged spike of hatred for his weakness, for the way he relied on me to navigate the world for him. His love had become a prison of soft pillows and predictable schedules, a cage that I was now systematically dismantling. Compared to the visceral reality of Malik, Arthur was nothing more than a ghost, a flickering image on a screen that had no substance. I wanted to forget his name, to drown the memory of our life together in the rising tide that hissed at our feet. My robe fell to the sand, a discarded shell of the woman I used to be, leaving me exposed to the cooling wind and his heated gaze. The risk of being discovered was a constant, sharp edge that made every sensation more acute, every breath a gamble. We were only a few hundred yards from the resort's security lights, yet we might as well have been on another planet. I enjoyed the feeling of the rough wood of the boat against my back, a splintered ancient surface that offered no comfort. Malik moved with a predatory focus, his hands exploring the landscape of my body with a clinical, almost cruel curiosity. He did not ask for permission, and I did not offer any resistance. Our roles were defined by the silence that hung between us. I was fascinated by the way his hands looked against me, dark shadows against the milk-white canvas of my skin, like a permanent mark of my transgression. I felt a strange sense of victory in my own degradation, a feeling of finally achieving a truth that had been hidden beneath layers of social standing and corporate success. This was the raw, pulsing heart of existence that I had been denied, a moment of pure, unadulterated consequence that required no justification, no guilt, and no apology. The sound of the ocean was a constant, rhythmic roar that drowned out the noise of my own thoughts. It was as if the water was cheering for my descent, a natural force that understood the necessity of destruction before creation. I could hear the creak of the old boat and the rustle of the palm fronds, but these sounds were distant, relegated to the background of the intense physical reality of the man before me. Every sense I possessed was focused on him, on the way he looked, the way he smelled, and the way he commanded my very existence without saying a single word. In that darkness I was entirely his. I knew that what I was doing was a betrayal of every vow I had ever taken, a mockery of the life my parents had expected of me. Yet there was no guilt, only a profound sense of relief as I let the last vestiges of my morality slip away into the dark water. I was no longer a wife, a business leader, or a citizen of a civilized nation. I was a creature of instinct, reacting to the gravity of a more powerful entity. The darkness provided a sanctuary for my decay, a place where I could rot and bloom at the same time, away from the judging eyes of a world that demanded perfection at all costs. He forced me to look at him, his fingers gripping my chin with a pressure that was almost painful. In his eyes I saw no affection, only a deep, calculating awareness that he had successfully dismantled the barriers I had spent a lifetime building. I found myself clinging to him, my nails digging into his shoulders as I sought to ground myself in his strength. The world around us seemed to narrow down to a single point of heat and friction, a collision of two vastly different worlds that resulted in a blinding, silent explosion of feeling. I was finally truly alive, even if it was only for a few stolen hours. Afterward, we lay in the shadows of the boat, the silence returning like a cold wave to reclaim the beach. The air was cooling, and I could feel the dampness of the sand beginning to seep into my skin, but I made no move to get up. I watched the stars through the gaps in the palm leaves, their light feeling cold and distant compared to the fire that had just consumed me. Malik was already drifting away, his attention returning to the horizon, his body becoming a part of the landscape once more. He had taken what he wanted, and in return, he had given me the gift of my own destruction, a heavy debt. I slowly gathered my robe, the silk now stained with salt and sand, a ruinous souvenir of my midnight excursion. I did not look back as I walked toward the resort, my body feeling heavy and foreign, as if I were learning how to walk for the very first time. The lights of the hotel looked fake and gaudy against the majesty of the night, a pathetic attempt to stave off the encroaching darkness. As I reached the door to the gardens, I paused to look out at the ocean one last time, feeling a deep, unsettling certainty that I could never go back to the woman I was. The tide was coming in fast. The suite was exactly as I had left it, the air-conditioned silence feeling like a physical blow after the heat of the beach. I moved quietly across the room, my eyes fixed on the bed where Arthur still lay in his motionless, drugged state. He looked so small, so inconsequential, that I felt a sudden urge to laugh, a hysterical bubble of sound that I barely managed to suppress. I washed the salt from my skin in the marble shower, the hot water feeling like an intrusion after the raw intensity of Malik's touch. I scrubbed myself until my skin was red, but the scent of him remained under my nails. I lay down beside my husband, the cool sheets feeling like a shroud as I stared at the ceiling. My heart was still beating with a frantic, uneven rhythm, a constant reminder of the risk I had just taken and the hunger that remained unsatisfied. I could still feel the phantom pressure of Malik's hands on my skin, a ghost that would haunt me throughout the coming days. I was trapped between two worlds, a prisoner of the safety I hated and a slave to the danger I craved. As the first hint of dawn began to gray the horizon, I knew that this was only the beginning of my long, dark end. The light began to crawl across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air of our expensive prison. I watched the golden sliver reach Arthur's hand, which lay limp and pale against the white duvet. He would wake soon, and he would ask me how I slept, and I would lie to him with a smile that reached my eyes. I would play the role of the devoted wife for another day, while the sand of the beach still gritted between my toes. The transition back to reality was a slow, agonizing process of rebuilding a mask that no longer fit the face of the woman who had stood in the shadows. I felt a strange, cold power in the secret I carried, a weapon that I could use to destroy everything we had built if I ever chose to speak. But I did not want destruction yet. I wanted the repetition of the crime. I wanted to feel the rough wood of the boat and the heat of the night again and again until there was nothing left of Claire the businesswoman. I closed my eyes, trying to catch one last moment of the ocean's roar before the world of schedules and mineral water returned to claim me. The sun was rising, but for me, the night had only just begun to take hold. 7 days had bled into one another, a blur of salt, sweat, and the illicit heat of the nights. My life in Connecticut felt like a distant, gray memory, something belonging to a woman I had buried in the sand of this island. Arthur was currently confined to the darkened bedroom of our villa. His skin flushed a painful shade of crimson. The tropical sun had finally broken his fragile constitution during a morning walk on the cliffs. He lay there with a damp cloth over his eyes, complaining about the throbbing in his temples and the unfairness of the weather. I felt no pity, only a soaring sense of release as I left him behind in the shadows. The room smelled of mentholated rub and the sterile scent of the air purifier he insisted on running at full blast. I had watched him sip lukewarm water through a straw, his hand shaking slightly as he navigated the simple task. There was a profound exhaustion in his movements, a sense that he had finally realized he did not belong in a place this vibrant and unforgiving. As I closed the heavy mahogany door, the click of the latch sounded like a sentence being served. I walked out into the hallway, feeling the weight of the humidity settle on me like a warm, wet blanket, welcoming me back to the world of the living. The path down to the shoreline was overgrown with vines that seemed to reach out and snag my clothing as I passed. I felt a surge of energy, a frantic desire to reach the coast where Malik was waiting for me. Every breath was a challenge, the air thick with the scent of blooming orchids and the salty tang of the approaching tide. I passed several other villas, their occupants hidden behind closed shutters, hiding from the very sun I was now embracing. My feet moved with a purpose I had never known in the city, a primitive drive toward the man who had unlocked the cage of my own making and set my soul on fire. I reached the edge of the resort where the cobblestones turned to packed earth, and the sounds of the hotel were replaced by the rhythmic beat of local music. Small houses with peeling paint lined the road, their porches occupied by men who watched me with a quiet, knowing curiosity. I was a ghost in their world, a white woman with too much money and not enough sense, but I did not care about their judgment. I was searching for the skeletal silhouette of the bar where Malik said he would be found. The heat was a living thing, pulsing against my skin and making the horizon shimmer in a dizzying haze of gold. The bar was called the Blue Anchor, though the paint had long ago faded to a dusty gray and the anchor itself was a rusted relic leaning against the entrance. It was a structure built on hope and salvaged timber, hanging precariously over the dark, churning water. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the gaps in the roof. The air was cool here, smelling of old rum, tobacco, and the deep, briny scent of the sea. I saw him sitting at a table in the back, his dark form silhouetted against the bright expanse of the ocean. He looked like he had been part of the world for 1,000 years. Malik was leaning back in his chair, his large hands resting on the table with a stillness that was almost hypnotic. He wore a simple white shirt that was open at the throat, the fabric contrasting sharply with the deep, rich tone of his skin. He did not move as I sat down across from him, but I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He was a man who moved only when necessary, a predator who saved his energy for the moments that truly mattered. I felt a flutter in my stomach, a mixture of fear and a desperate, clawing attraction that made it hard to breathe in the salt-heavy air. I reached across the scarred wood of the table and covered his hand with mine, feeling the heat and the texture of his calloused skin. His fingers did not move to grasp mine. They remained as still and unyielding as stone, yet I felt a jolt of electricity travel up my arm. My pale hand looked like a piece of driftwood caught against the dark shore of his presence. I leaned in closer, the scent of his skin, a mixture of salt and a spicy unidentified musk, filling my senses and clouding my thoughts. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to throw myself into the void just to see if I could fly. I began to talk about New York, my voice trembling with an intensity that I could not suppress. I described the penthouse on the Upper West Side where the city lights stretched out like a carpet of diamonds beneath the window. I told him about the silence of the high floors, and the way the world looked small and manageable from such a height. I wanted him to imagine a life where he did not have to work for tips or deal with the arrogance of tourists. I was offering him a ticket out of the dust and the heat, a chance to be something more than a guide in a forgotten paradise. My words came fast. I suggested that he could come as my personal head of security, a title that would command respect and allow him to walk beside me in the halls of my corporation. I imagined him in dark, expensive wool, his presence acting as a shield between me and the vultures of the business world. He would not just be an employee. He would be my constant companion, my silent partner in a world that was as cold and sharp as a razor blade. I would buy him a car, an apartment of his own, and give him a salary that would make him a king back on this island. I was painting a masterpiece of control and luxury. I did not realize that I was describing a golden cage, a way to keep his wildness and his power within my reach at all times. I wanted to own the feeling he gave me, to package it and take it back to the gray streets of my real life. I thought that money could bridge the gap between our worlds, that my status could somehow legitimize the raw, primal connection we had forged on the beach. I spoke of bank accounts and legal papers, of passports and visas, turning our illicit passion into a series of transactions. I was a businesswoman after all, and I believed that everything had a negotiable price. As I spoke, Malik's eyes remained fixed on mine, his pupils dark and unreadable. A slow, strange smile began to tug at the corners of his mouth, a look that held a chilling amount of sympathy. He did not interrupt my monologue, letting me pour out all my delusions and desires until the air was thick with the scent of my own desperation. He looked at me as if I were a child playing with fire, unaware of the heat or the potential for destruction. It was a smile that suggested he knew something I did not, a secret that made my offers of money and status seem like nothing more than colorful trinkets. The sun had reached the edge of the world, hanging low and heavy like a ripening fruit. The sky was no longer blue. It was a riot of bruised oranges, deep purples, and a red so dark it looked like drying blood. The light flooded into the bar, illuminating the dust motes and making the bottles of rum on the shelf glow with an internal fire. The water beneath us seemed to thicken, the waves turning into slow, heavy swells of crimson that slapped against the rotting pilings. The entire world was being drowned in the color of a wound, a visual warning that I was too consumed by my own narrative to heed. I watched him and felt a surge of triumph, believing that his silence was a form of acceptance. I thought I had found the one thing he could not refuse, the chance to escape his circumstances and walk into a world of absolute comfort. I felt a sense of ownership over him, as if the words I had spoken had already formed the bars of his new life. I was already imagining our arrival at the airport, the cold air hitting us as we stepped off the plane, and the look on the faces of my associates when they saw the man I had brought back from the tropics. I was convinced that I had won the ultimate prize. Malik's gaze shifted from my eyes to the heavy gold watch I wore on my left wrist, a piece that cost more than most people on this island made in 10 years. He reached out and touched the metal with one dark finger, a gesture that was slow and deliberately intimate. I felt a shiver of pleasure, thinking he was admiring the gift I was already prepared to give him. But his touch was clinical, his eyes assessing the value of the object with a cold, detached precision that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The sympathetic smile remained on his lips, but it was starting to feel like a mask. The local music from the village seemed to grow louder, the drums a steady, thumping heartbeat that echoed the racing of my own pulse. The air in the bar became stagnant, the sea breeze failing to push through the heavy wall of heat that surrounded us. I looked around and realized we were the only ones left in the structure, the other patrons having slipped away into the twilight. We were isolated in this house of driftwood, trapped between the blood-red ocean and the dark, encroaching jungle. I felt a sudden sharp pang of vulnerability, a realization that I was miles away from any security. The final sliver of the sun disappeared behind the horizon, and the crimson light was instantly swallowed by a deep, bruising indigo. In the sudden gloom, Malik's eyes seemed to change completely, the sympathy vanishing like a mirage in the desert. They became hard, obsidian stones that reflected nothing of the light or the warmth I had tried to offer. He slowly withdrew his hand from mine and leaned back, the shadows of the bar's rafters falling across his face like a cage. He looked at me with a cold, predatory clarity that stripped away my illusions, leaving me naked and foolish in the dark. I thought of the villa, of Arthur waking up in the dark and calling my name, his voice thin and trembling in the air-conditioned silence. I thought of the safety of the beige walls and the security guards at the gate, realizing how far I had strayed from the world that protected me. The Blue Anchor was no longer a romantic hideout. It was a trap, a place of rotting wood and dark water where a woman could vanish without a trace. I wanted to stand up and leave, to run back to the sanitized comfort of my marriage, but my legs felt like lead and my heart was a heavy weight in my chest. The night had fully taken hold, the only light coming from the distant, flickering torches of the resort further up the coast. I felt the shift in the wind, a cool, ominous breeze that carried the scent of rain and distant thunder. Malik's smile had disappeared completely, his mouth set in a hard, uncompromising line that suggested the time for fantasies was over. I had tried to buy a piece of the wild, but I was beginning to realize that the wild could not be owned. It could only be survived. I sat there in the dark, waiting for him to speak the words that would change our lives forever. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth as I navigated the narrow, unlit paths on the outskirts of the village. The luxury of the resort was a world away, replaced by the raw, unpolished reality of the island's interior. Every shadow seemed to vibrate with the hum of invisible insects, and the distant sound of a barking dog echoed through the trees like a warning I was choosing to ignore. I felt a frantic, electric anticipation buzzing in my fingertips, convinced that this final night would be the culmination of the dark transformation I had sought so desperately. I reached the small square house perched on the edge of a ravine, its corrugated metal roof reflecting the silver light of a dying moon. The structure looked fragile, held together by patches of rust and the stubborn grip of the surrounding vines. I paused at the threshold, smoothing the charcoal silk of my robe beneath my light coat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I expected the air inside to be thick with the scent of him and the promise of a farewell that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was ready to surrender everything one last time. The door was slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of cold blue light to spill out into the dirt yard. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in a way that set my teeth on edge. Instead of candles or the rhythmic beat of the local music I had grown to associate with him, the room was silent and smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Malik was sitting at a small wooden table in the center of the room, the glow from a laptop screen illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He didn't look up as I entered, his fingers moving with a chilling mechanical efficiency over the keyboard. I stood there, feeling the weight of my own expectations collapse into a confused, hollow silence. The silk of my robe felt suddenly ridiculous, a costume for a play that had been cancelled without my knowledge. I took a step toward him, my voice a mere whisper as I called his name, hoping to find a trace of the heat that had consumed us on the beach. But he remained still, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes like twin chips of ice. The intimacy I thought we shared felt like it was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, clinical atmosphere that I didn't recognize. Without a word of greeting, he reached out and turned the laptop toward me, his movements devoid of any of the predatory grace I had admired. I leaned forward, my eyes straining to make sense of the images flickering across the screen. At first, I thought they were just photos of the island, but as he began to scroll, the breath died in my throat. I saw woman after woman, all of them white, all of them roughly my age, and all of them looking at the camera with the same mixture of boredom and desperate, illicit hunger. They were captured in the same poses I had assumed. The gallery seemed endless, a digital record of 100 different vacations and 100 different betrayals. I saw them on the same beach, under the same old boat, and in the same hidden spots by the waterfall. Each photo was a mirror of my own secret rebellion, showing me that my unique transformative experience was nothing more than a recurring chapter in a well-worn script. These women were well-dressed, affluent, and hopelessly cliché, their faces etched with the same delusion of finding freedom in the arms of a stranger. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my chest. Malik finally looked up, and the expression on his face was one of weary professional detachment. His voice was dry and businesslike, stripped of the spicy musk and the gravelly warmth that had once made my skin tingle. He spoke with a clarity that was more painful than a physical blow, telling me that he had no intention of ever seeing New York or living in a penthouse on the Upper West Side. He didn't want my status or my world. He viewed my life as a sterile, gray prison that he had no desire to enter. To him, I was simply another seasonal resource to be harvested. He explained that he had watched dozens of women like me offer him the same golden cages and the same promises of a better life. He mocked my belief that I could buy a piece of the wild and take it home as a souvenir. He told me that he preferred the heat and the dust of his own world to the soft, pampered existence I represented. The sympathy I had seen in his eyes at the bar had not been for my boredom, but for my predictable vanity. I was not his savior or his lover. I was a customer who had forgotten the terms of the transaction we were truly engaged in. The true nature of the evening was revealed when he pulled up a folder labeled with my name and the date of our arrival. Inside were video files, grainy and dark, but clear enough to show every moment of my transgression in agonizing detail. He told me that he needed $50,000 for his silence and for the permanent deletion of the footage. The amount was precise, calculated to be high enough to hurt but low enough for a woman of my standing to procure without raising immediate suspicion. It was a ransom for the life I had so carelessly tried to throw away. He laughed then, a sharp, harsh sound that echoed off the thin walls of the cabin. He called me a tourist, a word that sounded like a slur in the quiet room. He pointed out how easy it was to manipulate women who were so starved for feeling that they would mistake a predator's grip for a lover's embrace. My pale skin and my expensive clothes were just marks of my vulnerability, signs that I was ripe for this specific type of exploitation. I felt small, foolish, and utterly defeated, the woman of power and intellect reduced to a shivering girl caught in a trap of her own making. I looked around the room, the reality of my situation finally sinking in. There was no escape here, no security guards to call, and no husband to hide behind. I was in the heart of a village that didn't know me, in a house that didn't exist on any map I had studied. The humidity seemed to tighten its grip on my throat, making it impossible to scream even if I had the strength to do so. Malik sat back, waiting for my answer with the patience of a man who had done this many times before. He knew I would pay, and he knew that I would never speak of this night again. The silence was suddenly broken by a soft rhythmic creak from the front of the house. I turned toward the door, my heart stopping as a shadow fell across the threshold. I expected one of Malik's associates, perhaps someone to help him enforce his demands. But as the door swung open, the moonlight revealed a figure that looked entirely out of place in this den of corruption. It was Arthur, standing there in his beige hiking shorts and a polo shirt that was perfectly pressed despite the late hour. He looked like he had just stepped out of a brochure for a quiet suburban afternoon. He wasn't shaking, and he wasn't gasping for air as he had been in the jungle. Instead, he looked remarkably calm, his face a mask of domestic tranquility that I found more terrifying than Malik's threats. In his right hand he held the heavy black-handled diving knife he had purchased on our first day at the resort. The blade caught the blue light of the laptop, a jagged silver tooth that looked far more functional than decorative. He stepped into the room with a focused, steady gait, his eyes moving from me to Malik with a strange clinical detachment that I didn't recognize. Arthur didn't ask what was happening, and he didn't demand an explanation for my presence in another man's home. He simply looked at the laptop screen, taking in the images of the other women and the video files that bore my name. A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips, as if he were disappointed by the lack of originality in the guide's scheme. He looked at Malik not with fear, but with the quiet contempt of a man who had discovered a flaw in a piece of equipment he intended to discard. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the air becoming cold and razor-sharp. Malik started to rise, his hand reaching for something beneath the table, but he stopped when he saw the look in Arthur's eyes. My husband wasn't the weak, submissive man I had spent 12 years patronizing. In this light, he looked like a person who had been waiting for a reason to stop pretending. He spoke for the first time, his voice low and steady, telling me to step back toward the corner of the room. I obeyed without question, my mind reeling as I watched the man I thought I knew transform into something lethal and efficient right before my eyes. The trap had changed owners. The sound of the laptop being snapped shut was the only warning. Arthur moved with a speed that defied his soft appearance, the diving knife becoming a blur in the dim light. Malik let out a choked sound of surprise, his eyes widening as he realized that the tourist he had been mocking was not the victim he had imagined. I pressed my back against the wall, my hands over my mouth, watching as the shadows of the two men danced against the corrugated metal. The world of mineral water and spreadsheets was gone, replaced by a raw ancient violence that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The room smelled of copper and fear, the blue light of the screen now replaced by the shifting silver glow of the moon. I realized then that Arthur had known about us all along, that his weakness had been a mask far more sophisticated than my own. He wasn't there to save my reputation. He was there to claim the only thing that mattered to him. As Malik fell back against the table, the laptop sliding to the floor with a heavy thud, I saw the truth of my marriage. We were not a couple built on love or trust, but on a shared capacity for darkness that was only now being revealed. Arthur stood over the guide, his breathing steady and his expression as neutral as if he were checking a weather report. He wiped the blade of the knife on his sleeve, his movements precise and methodical. Then he turned to me, and for the first time in my life I saw him clearly. He wasn't my husband. He was my accomplice. He reached out a hand to me, his fingers bloodstained but steady, and I took it. I realized that the $50,000 didn't matter, and the videos didn't matter. The only thing that remained was the heavy, suffocating bond of the blood we were about to hide together. The jungle inhaled the sound of Malik's final, choked cry before it could even drift past the porch of the cabin. It was a sharp, jagged noise that was instantly smothered by the heavy, indifferent pressure of the tropical night. I stood frozen in the corner, my hand still pressed against my mouth, watching the man I had lived with for 12 years transform into a stranger. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick and vibrating with the energy of the sudden, brutal transition. I could hear the hum of the laptop's fan and the frantic thumping of my own heart, but the world outside remained perfectly still, as if the earth itself were complicit in the act. Arthur did not look at me immediately, nor did he show any sign of the frantic panic I expected from a man who had just taken a life. He stood over the body with his shoulders squared, his breathing rhythmic and deep, as if he had just finished a light session at the gym. He reached into his pocket and produced a clean white handkerchief, methodically wiping the dark, viscous fluid from the black handle of the diving knife. His movements were clinical and precise, devoid of the hesitation that had defined our entire marriage. For the first time, I realized that the man I had considered a weakling was merely a man who had never before found a task worthy of his full attention. The blue light of the laptop continued to flicker, casting ghostly shadows against the corrugated metal walls of the hut. Arthur finally turned toward me, and his expression was not one of accusation or grief, but of a calm, almost terrifying authority. He did not ask me why I was there or how I could have been so foolish as to fall for such a transparent scheme. He simply walked over to the table, snapped the laptop shut with a definitive click, and tucked it under his arm as if it were a morning newspaper. The shift in power was so absolute that I felt a strange submissive heat rise in my chest, a reaction to a dominance that was far more real than anything Malik had ever mimicked. He reached into the small travel bag he had brought and pulled out a clean, folded towel, tossing it toward me without a word. I caught it reflexively, the fabric smelling of the expensive detergent we used back home in Connecticut, a scent that felt violently out of place in this room of rot and blood. Arthur told me to wipe the sweat and the dirt from my face, his voice steady and devoid of any tremor. He didn't raise his tone, yet his command carried a weight that made my knees tremble. I was no longer the one in control, and the realization brought with it a wave of relief that was as sickening as it was profound. We didn't speak as he began the process of preparing the body for its final journey into the dark heart of the island. Arthur moved with a mechanical efficiency, using a coil of heavy nylon rope to bind the guide's limbs into a compact, manageable shape. I watched his pale, steady hands work the knots, the same hands that had meticulously organized our vacation schedules and checked the seals on our bottled water. Every movement was a revelation, a display of a hidden capacity for violence that had been simmering beneath the surface of our sterile life for over a decade. He was not a victim of my betrayal. He was the architect of our survival. When he was finished, he looked at me and pointed toward the feet, indicating that he expected me to help him carry the weight. I moved forward, my silk robe rustling against the blood-stained floorboards, and gripped the cold, heavy ankles of the man I had once thought was my escape. Together, we navigated the narrow doorway and stepped out into the oppressive heat of the jungle. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sulfurous odor of the nearby swamp, a mixture that seemed to cling to my skin like a second, filthier garment. We moved away from the light of the cabin, disappearing into the tangled, ancient growth of the trees. The trek through the undergrowth was an agonizing test of endurance, the darkness of the forest closing in around us like a physical wall. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the silence, and the distant cries of night birds felt like a chorus of witnesses to our crime. Arthur led the way, his pace relentless as he forged a path through the dense ferns and twisted lianas. I struggled to keep my grip, the weight of the body pulling at my muscles and the humid air burning in my lungs. We were deep in the territory of the wild now, far beyond the reach of the resort's manicured paths and the safety of the world we had left behind. We reached a massive ancient mangrove tree that stood at the edge of a stagnant black pool of water. Its roots were like giant, skeletal fingers reaching deep into the mud, creating a natural cage of wood and silt. Arthur dropped his end of the burden and reached for the small, collapsible shovel he had carried in his rucksack. He began to dig beneath the roots, his movements rhythmic and tireless as he carved a hole into the saturated earth. The sound of the metal blade slicing through the muck was the only noise in the clearing, a wet, sucking sound that resonated in the hollow of my chest with every strike. I stood by the edge of the water, watching the silver moonlight reflect off the surface of the swamp. The heat was a constant pressure, and the mosquitoes were a frantic cloud around my head, but I felt a strange, numbing detachment from the physical world. I looked at Arthur, his shirt soaked with sweat and his face set in a grim, triumphant mask as he worked to bury the evidence of my sin. He wasn't doing this out of love, I realized. He was doing it to reclaim his property. By helping him, I was signing a new contract, one written in the mud and the blood of a man who had underestimated the quiet ones. Finally, the grave was deep enough to satisfy him. We rolled the body into the dark, wet earth, and I watched as the black mud slowly began to swallow the colorful shirt and the dark skin of the man who had promised me freedom. Arthur didn't offer a prayer or a moment of silence. He simply began to shovel the earth back into the hole, tamping it down with his boots until the surface was level with the rest of the forest floor. He then spent another 20 minutes meticulously covering the site with fallen leaves and rotting branches, ensuring that the jungle would reclaim its own in a matter of days. When the task was finished, Arthur stood back and surveyed the area with a critical eye, looking for any sign that we had ever been there. He seemed satisfied with the result, his breathing finally beginning to slow as the adrenaline of the labor faded into a cold, hard resolve. He turned to me and took the bloodied towel from my hand, throwing it into the center of the swamp where it sank beneath the oily surface. He then reached out and took my chin in his hand, his grip firm and possessive. He told me that we were leaving the island in the morning, and that I would never speak of this place or this man again. The walk back to the resort was a blur of exhaustion and a growing dark clarity. We slipped through the service entrance of our villa, the air-conditioned chill of the room hitting me like a physical blow. Arthur told me to go into the bathroom and wash myself thoroughly, instructing me to use the hottest water I could stand. I stood under the shower for a long time, watching the brown, muddy water swirl down the drain, taking with it the last remnants of my tropical fantasy. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, but I could still feel the phantom weight of the body on my arms and the scent of the swamp in my hair. When I stepped out, the room was already partially packed. Arthur had moved with his usual efficiency, folding our expensive linen clothes and organizing our toiletries as if we were merely finishing a pleasant holiday. He had already destroyed the laptop, the broken pieces of plastic and glass sitting in a neat pile on the marble counter. He looked up as I entered, his eyes cold and distant, yet there was a new kind of intimacy between us. We were no longer just a husband and a wife. We were a unit, a closed system held together by the gravity of a shared unspeakable secret. I felt a sense of security I had never known. As the first gray light of dawn began to touch the horizon, we finished the final preparations for our departure. I looked around the suite one last time, the luxury of the room now feeling like a fortress rather than a cage. The fear that had consumed me in Malik's cabin had been replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. I realized that my husband was the only thing standing between me and the abyss, and for the first time in 35 years, I felt a genuine, terrifying respect for him. He had saved my life, and in doing so, he had become my master in a way I could never challenge or escape. We checked out of the resort with the same polite, distant smiles we had used since our arrival. The staff thanked us for our stay, wishing us a safe flight back to the States, their eyes never seeing the darkness that we carried beneath our polished exteriors. The drive to the airport was quiet, the island passing by in a blur of vibrant green and blinding blue. I looked out at the jungle, knowing that deep within its heart, a man was rotting beneath the roots of a mangrove tree, and that the only two people who knew the truth were sitting in the back of a luxury sedan, holding hands. The transition back to our world began the moment we stepped into the business-class cabin of the aircraft. The plush leather seats and the scent of expensive champagne were a welcome return to the reality we understood. Arthur reached over and carefully adjusted the pillow behind my head, his touch gentle and domestic, yet I could still feel the strength in his fingers that had tightened the nylon rope. He asked me if I wanted anything to drink, his voice the same soft, apologetic tone he had used for 12 years. I looked at him and smiled, a genuine expression of gratitude for the safety he had provided. The plane took off, rising above the turquoise waters of the Caribbean and heading toward the gray, orderly coast of New England. I watched the island shrink until it was nothing more than a green speck in a vast, indifferent ocean. I knew that our life in Connecticut would be different now, stripped of the boredom and the pretense that had once threatened to tear us apart. We were returning to our suburb with a new foundation, a bond forged in the dark and sealed with the blood of a man who didn't matter. Our marriage was no longer a cage. It was a sanctuary protected by the silence of the woods. As the flight attendant brought us a tray of delicate appetizers, I noticed the other passengers looking at us with a quiet, unmistakable envy. They saw a beautiful, successful couple in their mid-30s, returning from a romantic getaway with the glow of the sun still on their skin. They couldn't see the stains on our souls or the weight of the secret we carried in our luggage. To them, we were the ideal, the pinnacle of the American dream. I leaned my head against Arthur's shoulder, closing my eyes and feeling a deep, unsettling peace. We had survived the paradise, and now we were going home to be perfect.